Welcome to the Weekly Report. It's March 11 and I'm Robert Barwick. In today's news, the CEC intervenes to save dairy farmers from British annihilation. Mass strike update. Gillard's polls falling faster than sea levels are rising. And 3, don't miss LaRouche on Ireland and America. So first, the CEC has intervened to save dairy farmers from British annihilation. Here's a question. How many Aussie dairy farmers will the British gang running the Coles price war have to kill before they regard it as a success? It is that calculated. Do not think that human beings and human lives are collateral damage in market wars. Market wars are an attack on the systems and institutions that support human life. The destruction to people that is as a consequence of this is deliberate. And if you don't believe that, go back and look at what we've reported about the Ritzer report into how the banks view the Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan to revise the Murray-Darling Basin, for example, and how in part of that report, the banks told Ritzer that they knew what to expect in terms of the human cost of the Murray-Darling Basin plan because they experienced the same thing with dairy deregulation in the year 2000, and what the comparison the banks were making to Ritzer was they saw the suicides then and they knew to expect another wave of suicides now. Which suicides we know are happening, but my point is the people pushing these policies know it, expect it, and push ahead, and it's not collateral damage. Those are the things that they intend to do as part of their determination to destroy the way a nation like Australia has systems to guarantee the living standards of its people. So that's the real issue here. And bear in mind that what's going on in all these areas that relate to food, including this dairy price war, is happening in the context of a global food shortage. The world is running out of food. The population is growing, but the food growing systems that can easily meet the needs of the population, it's not the population growth that's the problem, the food growing systems are being annihilated, and in that context, what's being done to food growing in Australia is a moral outrage, and we have a moral duty to fight it. So that said, the dairy price war that's going on now, the milk price war, has attracted a lot of attention, and I suspect because the general population are starting to realise, well, you know, is this a bridge too far? How many more industries can they continue to destroy like this? So as a consequence, there's a parliamentary committee. Senator Nick Xenophon is leading a Senate committee that's holding hearings and has held hearings into the milk price war this week. The CEC intervened on that. A couple of days ago, CEC leader Craig issued a statement. In that statement, he demanded parity pricing for farmers as the only way to actually save them from what's being done. That, you know, because if you've got parity pricing for farmers, let these big retailers knock themselves out. It doesn't matter, the farmers will get their price. Craig also demanded that the British gang in charge of Coles, who are running this, who he said they are a menace to Australia's national interest. Craig called for their visas to be revoked forthwith and they should be deported. Now, the members in Melbourne of the LaRouche Youth Movement, the Australian members, attended the Melbourne hearings of Senator Nick Xenophon's committee and distributed this statement around the attendees of the committee hearings. The youth also, as part of the accompanying Craig's statement, was a write-up that we've done exposing how this whole process is British. So, as stated, the actual gang in charge of Coles that started this is a British gang brought in by Wesfarmers from England. These guys ran British retailing in England, and while they were there, they ran the milk price wars in England that drove thousands of dairy farmers out of business and drove up the volume of milk imports that England now depends upon from places like Ireland and the Netherlands. In our statement, which you can read on our website, we point out that the whole process that this milk price war is in the context of, which is the deregulation of Australian industry, that whole process has been run from the beginning by the British and by British banks. I'll just go through some of the details of that. British bank Hill Samuel Limited, or Hill Samuel Australia Limited, which is a subsidiary of the Hill Samuel Limited in England, which is an arch establishment City of London bank. It's so high up in the establishment that the long-time head of British intelligence was its chairman. They set up their subsidiary in Australia in 1969, Hill Samuel Australia Limited. That is now Macquarie Bank. But that banking operation has run many of the economic reforms that have destroyed Australia. I won't go into the details of this, but it even includes, they managed the original floating of the dollar in 1983 by Hawke and Keating. Hill Samuel managed that. More to the point on this subject, Macquarie Bank wrote national competition policy. It was Macquarie Bank executive Fred Hilmer who wrote the Hilmer report, which recommended this total deregulation of the domestic Australian economy. They called it microeconomic reform, and the whole point was to strip away every regulation and protection industrially in the industries in Australia that protected the small producers in domestic industries from the big multinationals and the big corporations. That's what those protections were for. They guaranteed things like local production of certain things, such as milk, where, you know, people will remember once upon a time that all our milk that you drank was produced locally. These were all done under those local regulations. National competition policy set out to get rid of all of them, and they called it microeconomic reform, freeing up the Australian economy. Yeah, to what? To rapacious looting by large corporations, which is what's been done. So it was a Macquarie Bank executive who wrote that. The Council of Australian Governments accepted that as national policy in 1992. And then it was another Macquarie Bank executive, Graham Samuel, who was given the job of enforcing it. First as the head of the National Competition Council, and now in his current job as the head of the ACCC. Now let me say something about that particular role. I mean, people expect that the role of the boss of the ACCC is to protect the interests of the Australian people. Yet what they do is the opposite. And it's worse than saying something like they've put the fox in charge of the hen house. It's more evil than that. It's more calculated. A fox will do what a fox does in a hen house. This is more like putting a pedophile in charge of a nursery. That's what they've done by putting this guy in charge of this job. Graham Samuel, back in the 80s, is famous for saying that insider trading is good because it makes the market more efficient. That's who he represents. That's where he comes from, and his job is to oversee all this and supposedly make sure everything is competitive in Australia. And by that, people assume they mean fair, but what they mean is no protections from looting by these big guys, and that's what's been done. So under this new regime, Coles and Woolies, under the whole rubric of national competition policy, have turned into this giant duopoly. It's the biggest duopoly in the entire world. Something like 80% market share between these two retailers. Nowhere in the world has that. Even in the United States, where they've got the biggest retailer in the world, Walmart, you know, the top 3 or 4 retailers in America only have about 40% market share. In Australia, 2 retailers have this huge market share, and this has grown under national competition policy. Meanwhile, all the small guys have been run to the wall, and that's deliberate. And in the case, the dominance of Coles and Woolies is such, it's not just groceries, as Australians know, it's liquor and it's fuel as well. So the key things that everyone consumes on a daily basis, they dominate. At the Xenophon committee hearings, all the submissions reported total industry carnage from this milk price war. And here's an irony, even Woolies reported that. Now, Woolies is engaged in the price war. Woolies is actually complicit in the price war with Coles. They slashed their price of milk down as well. But even Woolies is saying, we can't keep this going. The only ones saying they can keep it going is Coles itself, because they're the ones with this British gang running them that obviously are running it with an intention. The worst submission to the Xenophon Committee, though, came from, you guessed it, the ACCC itself. And what did these guys at the ACCC say? There is no evidence that the milk price war is hurting farmers. That's why I made that analogy to the pedophile in charge of the nursery. The role, the calculated role that they are playing to use their position as supposedly the umpire to stand by and allow this kind of raping of the Australian economy to go on is evil. The big issue is collusion. Yes, there's Coles always insists there is. I mean, the ACCC always insists there is no collusion. Damn right, there's collusion, but the collusion is between Coles and Woolies and the ACCC against the Australian people, and that has to stop. So this is coming to a head, as you can tell, and we'll monitor it closely. All right. Second thing I want to report briefly, a mass strike update. Julia Gillard's polls are falling faster than the sea levels are rising. And the reason I say that is Ross Garnaut today has attracted attention, headlines, by saying that all the predictions about sea level rises now have to be revised. They're going to be much worse than anyone thought. And he specifically said something to the effect that Sydney can expect being swamped with water once a year from sea level rises instead of once a century. Now, of course, anyone knows anything about climate science and how astronomical cycles actually drive climate knows this is all claptrap. Read it in our literature. In fact, for those who get the Australian Alert Service, or if you don't, you should get it, this week's edition and next week's are printing a two-part article on the temperature increases since the Little Ice Age and the Middle Ages, which give you everything you need to know about climate science. It's all rubbish. But anyway, this is hysteria that we're getting from these clowns to ram home the point that we need a carbon tax. While they're trying to claim that, though, the real story is what's happened to Gillard's approval rating. This week, the opinion polls came out, the first one since she announced her carbon tax, and she is in free fall. Labor is down to 30% approval in the opinion polls. That hasn't been seen since, that's worse than the worst days of Paul Keating, apparently, before he lost office in the mid-90s. Why? The people aren't buying this. They are saying enough is enough, this is too much. The funny thing is nobody can understand why. And I talked about this last week, but it's just got worse. You'll see, the fact I'm saying this will make you recognise it when you see it on the news. For example, this last weekend, LaRouche, who, he's the heavyweight of the Australian media, he again wheeled out his attack on what he calls wingnuts and loonies behind this, what we call the mass strike. He's saying that the people that are questioning the carbon tax and are up in arms in Australia, they're wingnuts and loonies. And here's the bottom line, here's the real freak out. He's calling them that because of the similarity to the United States, to the kind of total intransigence among the population for really the first time at accepting the continual lies of the political class. They've stopped buying it, and he's freaked out, and the people he represents are freaked out that is coming here. The issue isn't, when it comes to what Laurie Oakes is on about with the wingnuts, etc., and Pauline Hanson coming out of the woodwork again and all that kind of stuff, none of that's the issue when it comes to the mass strike. The issue is not the agenda of the people who want to lead it. That's not the issue. The issue is what is driving the people to rise up. And what's driving the people is they sense an existential threat. This has gone on long enough on every front, and they're finally getting it. They sense an existential threat, and they are prepared to fight. And that's what unites Australians right now with all these similar revolutions right around the world, in Ireland, in the Middle East, etc. And that's good to know. And so what the CEC's message is to the Australian people, if you are prepared to fight, then you've got to be prepared to fight for principle, and that principle has to be the principle of the common good. And if you're prepared to fight for that, join the CEC. And finally, don't miss LaRouche on Ireland and America. If you want a very good, a brilliant analysis on what's going on with the global mass strike, you've got to watch LaRouche's latest webcast, which he delivered this morning, our time. The links will be on our website and the LaRouche Pack website. It's entitled Ireland and America. As LaRouche says, the mass strike is a global revolution against the British Empire, this evil monetarist empire that we've been exposing from the beginning of this movement. He's highlighting Ireland because of some, historical ironies that are all sort of coming to bear now. Ireland was the first victim of that evil empire because the empire, the British Empire, as we call it, really started in 1689 in the Glorious Revolution when William of Orange took over Britain, became the King of England, and William of Orange was taking over on behalf of what was called the New Venetian Party, and in England it was known as the Venetian faction. And that was the beginning of England going from being a kingdom to becoming an empire. And the first thing that William of Orange did was go and butcher the Irish. The Irish have resisted in various degrees that British imperial domination for 300 years. That resistance, for example, was crucial to America winning its War of Independence in the late 1700s, because part of the issue there was the British had to keep an eye on what was going on in Ireland as well as trying to fight the United States, and so the Irish resistance was crucial to helping America there. Now, in the context of the global financial collapse, which is unstoppable, it's the Irish that are leading the revolution again. That revolution's sweeping the world, and it's the same revolution that LaRouche is leading in America to reclaim America's anti-British constitutional heritage, which was America setting itself up to end monetarist imperialism and establish a world of sovereign nation states, which the last great American president, Franklin Roosevelt, was absolutely committed to. So for the details on that, watch LaRouche's webcast. And I also say next week the CEC will be producing our next New Citizen newspaper, something like 200,000 copies, on the same subject from an Australian standpoint, which will be Craig Isherwood's speech declaring a war of national liberation against the British Empire. So stay tuned for the announcement of that and audio copies of that, and get that out as widely as you can to everyone as well. So that said, that's the weekly report. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.